The hardest dreams to rebuild are usually the ones you convinced yourself were never worth chasing in the first place. My name is Adrian Foster, and for the longest time I believed talent was something that quietly disappeared when enough people stopped believing in it. At 27 years old, I lived in a small apartment outside Portland, Oregon, sharing the space with my roommate, Blake Harrison. People often assumed we had known each other forever because we moved through daily life with an effortless rhythm. He always brewed coffee before sunrise. I always washed the mugs before going to bed. He worked remotely for his family's agricultural business, while I spent my days shaping clay inside a tiny rented workshop that barely stayed open. Years ago, I dreamed of opening my own pottery studio, a place where children and adults could discover the quiet joy of creating something beautiful with their own hands. That dream slowly disappeared beneath unpaid bills, canceled art fairs, and customers who admired handmade pottery but rarely bought it. Eventually, I stopped introducing myself as an artist. I simply said I made ceramics when people asked what I did. It sounded smaller, safer, and somehow less disappointing. Every evening, I carried unsold bowls, cups, and small sculptures back home, carefully stacking them inside cardboard boxes that filled the apartment closet. I told myself I was saving them for another craft market, but deep down, I already knew the truth. I had stopped believing anyone would ever want them. Blake never argued with me about it. He was the kind of alpha who understood that broken confidence could not be repaired through speeches. Instead, he quietly supported me in ways most people would never notice. Some mornings he left fresh pastries beside my sketchbook before heading to work. Other days he simply asked whether I wanted company while glazing pottery in silence. He never pushed. He never judged. Then everything changed on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I had just returned from another disappointing weekend market where I sold only 2 coffee mugs after spending nearly 10 hours setting up my display. Without saying much, I carried the remaining boxes into the apartment and began wrapping every unfinished piece in newspaper. Blake watched from the kitchen for several minutes before walking toward me. "What are you doing?" he asked gently. I kept folding paper around another bowl without looking up. "Putting everything away." "For how long?" I shrugged. "Maybe forever." The words surprised even me, but once they escaped, I realized I meant them. Blake remained silent. A few minutes later, he disappeared into his bedroom. When he returned, he carried an old canvas travel bag instead of his laptop. He placed it beside the front door and looked directly at me with unusual seriousness. "I need you to come somewhere with me this weekend." I frowned. "Where?" "My family's farm." I stared at him in confusion. During the 2 years we had lived together, he had mentioned visiting relatives, but had never once spoken about a farm. "Why?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because there is something waiting there that belongs to you." I laughed quietly, convinced he was joking. "Blake, I have never even been to your family's farm." He smiled with calm certainty, the kind that somehow made every argument seem unnecessary. "That does not matter." I looked at the travel bag, then back at him, searching for any sign that this was some elaborate prank. Instead, I found only quiet hope reflected in his eyes. "Please trust me," he said softly. "Some dreams deserve one final chance before they disappear forever." The drive began before dawn while the streets of Portland were still wrapped in cool gray light, and the city had not fully awakened. Blake quietly loaded our bags into his old pickup truck, while I carried a single backpack containing little more than a few clothes and the sketchbook I had not opened in months. Neither of us spoke much as we left the apartment behind. The silence between us never felt awkward, but today it carried an unusual sense of anticipation, as though Blake already knew something that I could not yet understand. For the first hour, the road was lined with apartment buildings, coffee shops preparing for the morning rush, and familiar neighborhoods I had not thought about. Leaving until he invited me. Gradually, the skyline disappeared behind us, replaced by forests, rivers, and rolling hills that stretched farther than I could see. It had been years since I had traveled anywhere beyond local craft fairs, and I suddenly realized how small my world had quietly become. Around midday, we stopped at a family-owned diner beside a quiet country highway. The waitress greeted Blake by name before showing us to our usual booth, which surprised me immediately. "You come here often?" I asked. Blake smiled while stirring cream into his coffee. "Every time I drive home." "Home." He said the word with such quiet affection that I found myself wondering how many times he had made this journey without ever mentioning it. After lunch, we continued north along narrow country roads bordered by endless fields, old wooden fences, and brilliant patches of wildflowers dancing in the breeze. Horses wandered peacefully through open pastures, while distant barns rested beneath wide blue skies. The farther we traveled, the lighter my thoughts became, although I could not explain why. Perhaps I had simply forgotten what open space felt like after spending so many years surrounded by concrete and deadlines. Eventually, Blake turned onto a long gravel lane shaded by towering maple trees whose branches formed a natural arch overhead. At the end of the lane stood a beautiful white farmhouse surrounded by colorful gardens, a weathered red barn, rolling green fields, and several smaller buildings scattered across the property. Everything looked peaceful, timeless, and somehow welcoming before I had even stepped out of the truck. The front door opened almost immediately. An elderly woman hurried down the porch steps with surprising energy, embracing Blake warmly before turning toward me with a smile that felt strangely familiar. "Adrian," she said as though greeting an old friend. "We have been hoping you would finally come." My heart skipped. Blake introduced her as his grandmother, Eleanor, but that only made me more confused. I had never met her before. How did she know my name? Before I could ask, an older man carrying a basket of fresh vegetables tipped his hat toward me and smiled. "Welcome, Adrian." A young girl waved excitedly from the garden, while another neighbor crossing the yard greeted me with the same warmth. It felt as though everyone had been expecting my arrival except me. I turned toward Blake, waiting for an explanation that never came. He simply lifted my overnight bag from the truck and motioned toward the porch. "Just trust me a little longer," he said quietly. As I followed him toward the farmhouse, my eyes caught a weathered wooden sign hanging beside the front door. Someone had carefully restored the faded lettering until every word could once again be read clearly. It simply said, "Every creation finds its home." That evening, the farmhouse settled into a peaceful rhythm unlike anything I had experienced in years. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen while laughter floated across the porch where neighbors stopped by carrying homemade pies, baskets of vegetables, and bouquets of wildflowers. Everything felt warm and welcoming, yet every passing moment only deepened the mystery surrounding my arrival. During dinner, Eleanor smiled as she placed a handmade ceramic mug in front of me. The pale blue glaze immediately caught my attention because it looked remarkably similar to a style I had experimented with years earlier. I gently turned the mug in my hands and noticed a tiny carved mark hidden beneath the handle. It matched the signature I had once used on my own pottery before I stopped believing anyone would recognize it. My heart skipped. "Where did this come from?" I asked quietly. Eleanor exchanged a brief glance with Blake before smiling. Someone believed it deserved to be here. Before I could ask another question, Blake's grandfather casually changed the subject by asking whether I still preferred shaping clay early in the morning when the studio was completely quiet. I looked at him in disbelief. I had never shared that habit with anyone outside my apartment. The conversation moved on naturally while I remained silent, unable to understand how complete strangers seemed to know details of my life that I had barely spoken aloud. After dinner, I stepped outside, hoping the cool evening air would settle my thoughts. The sky stretched endlessly above the valley while thousands of stars slowly appeared one by one. I wandered through flower gardens until I reached a quiet clearing near the edge of the property where an old pottery wheel rested beneath a wooden shelter. Time had weathered the wood, but someone had clearly cared for it with remarkable attention. Beside the wheel stood a small display table covered with smooth stones and pieces of unfinished clay. Curious, I knelt beside the wheel and noticed two carefully carved initials along its side. "EF, my initials." A chill ran through me. Before I could touch the wheel, Eleanor approached carrying two warm mugs of tea. She handed one to me before sitting on the nearby bench. "Beautiful evening," she said softly. I nodded but could not hide my confusion any longer. "Have we met before?" She smiled with patient kindness. "Not the way you think." I looked back toward the pottery wheel. "Then why does everyone here seem to know me?" Eleanor watched the stars for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes a person's work arrives somewhere long before the person who created it." Her words lingered quietly between us. Before I could ask what she meant, Blake called from across the garden. "Adrian, come with me." We followed a winding stone path through rows of maple trees until we reached a beautifully restored wooden building standing quietly beyond the fields. Fresh white paint covered the walls, flower boxes overflowed beneath every window, and warm lights glowed behind tightly drawn curtains. The front door remained firmly locked with a heavy brass key resting in the handle. I turned toward Blake. "What is this place?" He rested one hand against the old wooden door and smiled with unmistakable emotion in his eyes. "It is the reason I asked you to trust me." I stepped closer, but he gently raised his hand. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "because once this door opens, you will never look at your own dreams the same way again." The next morning I woke before sunrise, unable to ignore the questions that had followed me since the moment Blake invited me to leave Portland. The farmhouse was still quiet when I walked downstairs. Fresh coffee waited on the kitchen counter beside a handwritten note in Blake's familiar handwriting. "Meet me outside when you are ready." I carried the warm mug onto the porch where cool morning air drifted across the fields carrying the scent of wildflowers, fresh earth, and dew-covered grass. Golden sunlight slowly climbed above the distant hills, painting the entire valley with soft amber light. Everything looked peaceful, but inside my mind every mystery only seemed to grow larger. The strange ceramic mug, the pottery wheel with my initials, complete strangers somehow knowing details about my life. None of it made sense. A few minutes later, Blake emerged from the barn carrying an old ring of heavy brass keys. Without speaking, he motioned for me to follow. We walked together along the familiar stone path beneath towering maple trees whose leaves shimmered gently in the morning breeze. Birds filled the quiet air with song while sunlight filtered through the branches, creating moving patterns across the path beneath our feet. Eventually, we reached the restored wooden building once again. In the bright morning light, I noticed details I had missed before. Every flower box had been freshly watered. Handmade clay planters decorated the porch, each one unique in shape and glaze. Wind chimes crafted from polished ceramic pieces swayed softly beneath the roof. Whoever had restored this place had done so with extraordinary care. Blake stopped in front of the heavy wooden door without reaching for the keys immediately. Instead, he rested one hand against the weathered wood and looked across the surrounding fields. "This used to be my grandfather's workshop," he said quietly. "After he retired, nobody used it for years." He reached into his jacket and carefully removed a small cream-colored envelope with my name written neatly across the front. The paper looked slightly worn, as though he had carried it for a very long time. He placed it gently into my hands. "Promise me you will not read this until you are inside." I nodded without hesitation. My curiosity had become almost impossible to contain, but something in his expression told me this moment mattered more than I understood. Blake inserted the first brass key into the lock. A soft metallic click echoed through the quiet morning. Then came the second lock. Another quiet click. My heartbeat seemed louder than either one. Before unlocking the final lock, Blake turned toward me with calm eyes filled with unmistakable hope. "For a long time," he said softly, "you believed your hands stopped creating beautiful things because people stopped believing in your work." He paused for a brief moment before continuing. "I only hope that after today you finally understand your gift never disappeared. It was simply waiting for you to believe in it again." He placed the final key into the lock and slowly turned it. The heavy mechanism released with one quiet sound. Sunlight spilled through the narrow opening as the old wooden door slowly swung inward, revealing nothing except a warm golden glow beyond the entrance, while every answer I had been searching for remained hidden just beyond the threshold. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the world outside seemed to disappear. Warm morning sunlight poured through tall windows, filling the room with a soft golden glow that reflected from polished wooden floors and shelves lined with carefully arranged pottery. For several long seconds I could not move. What had once been an abandoned workshop had been transformed into the most beautiful ceramic studio I had ever seen. Professional pottery wheels stood beside large work tables crafted from reclaimed oak. Shelves displayed jars filled with colorful glazes, neatly organized carving tools, sculpting instruments, and bags of fresh clay waiting to be shaped. Along one wall stood a modern kiln beside an older brick kiln that had been lovingly restored, connecting generations of craftsmanship in a single room. The air carried the familiar scent of clay, cedar wood, and fresh earth. It smelled exactly like the future I had once imagined for myself before I stopped believing it could exist. Then my eyes drifted toward the gallery wall at the far end of the studio. Every shelf held ceramic pieces I recognized immediately. The first coffee mug I had ever sold at a local craft fair. The uneven bowl I almost threw away because I believed it was imperfect. The blue vase that had won a small community art award years earlier before disappearing after the exhibition ended. Even experimental sculptures I had quietly abandoned during difficult months somehow stood displayed beneath warm gallery lights, each resting on handcrafted wooden pedestals with small engraved nameplates describing when they had been created. My hands trembled as I slowly walked through the room, recognizing not only every finished piece, but every forgotten version of myself reflected inside them. Then I remembered the envelope Blake had placed into my hands. I carefully opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The first sentence blurred almost immediately as unexpected tears filled my eyes. Beautiful things do not lose their value simply because the world becomes too busy to notice them. I lowered the page and turned toward Blake, unable to speak. He quietly stepped beside me, his voice calm but filled with quiet emotion. I started collecting your work almost 3 years ago. Whenever one of your pieces appeared at a craft market, a local gallery, an online listing, or even a secondhand shop, I found a way to bring it here. Sometimes friends helped. Sometimes neighbors searched for them too. I slowly shook my head in disbelief. Why would anyone do that? Blake smiled gently. Because every time you called yourself a failure, I knew your work deserved someone who refused to give up on it. My eyes wandered toward the center of the studio where a single pottery wheel faced the largest window overlooking the fields. Above it hung a beautifully carved wooden sign that stole every remaining word from my lips. Adrian Foster Ceramic Studio. Beside the wheel rested a brand new leather apron, untouched sketchbooks filled with blank pages, and fresh blocks of clay waiting for hands that had almost forgotten how to dream. Blake quietly looked toward the sunlight pouring through the windows before speaking once more. This place was never built to preserve everything you thought you had lost, he said softly. It was built so you could finally create everything that still belongs to your future. For several long minutes, I wandered through the ceramic studio without saying a single word. Every shelf, every pottery wheel, every carefully restored kiln carried the unmistakable feeling that someone had spent years protecting a dream I had already abandoned. I stopped beside the first coffee mug I had ever sold and gently traced my fingers across the familiar glaze. I still remembered staying awake until 2 a.m. trying to perfect its shape before packing it into a cardboard box for my very first craft fair. At the time, I believed it marked the beginning of my future. Standing inside this studio, I realized it had never truly become part of my past. Blake quietly walked beside me without interrupting my thoughts. Eventually, we reached another room separated by large glass doors. Inside stood long wooden tables surrounded by smaller pottery wheels, shelves filled with beginner tools, aprons hanging neatly on handcrafted hooks, and cabinets stocked with fresh clay waiting to be used. Sunlight poured through wide windows overlooking the flower gardens outside. On one wall, a large chalkboard displayed plans for community pottery classes, children's workshops, weekend family sessions, and seasonal exhibitions featuring local artists. Above the board, someone had carved a simple sentence into reclaimed oak. Every pair of hands can create something beautiful. I looked toward Blake with growing disbelief. This is not just a studio. He smiled softly. It was never meant to be only that. He carefully unrolled a large blueprint across one of the work tables. The drawing revealed the entire property surrounding the building. Outdoor pottery stations overlooked the fields where students could work during the summer. Small guest cottages welcomed visiting ceramic artists. Walking paths connected sculpture gardens with quiet reflection spaces. A covered pavilion stood beside a peaceful pond where community art festivals could be held each autumn. At the top of the blueprint, written in careful handwriting, were 4 simple words: the Clay and Community Project. I studied every detail, realizing this vision extended far beyond anything I had ever imagined for myself. You planned all of this? I asked quietly. Blake nodded. Long before I knew exactly who would lead it. He looked toward the restored kiln before continuing. I always believed this farm could become a place where people remembered that making something with their own hands could also help heal their hearts. His words settled deeply inside me. For years I had measured my work by sales, exhibitions, and whether enough customers bought what I created. Standing inside the studio, I suddenly understood that pottery had never been only about finished pieces. It was about patience, hope, mistakes, second chances, and creating beauty from ordinary earth. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. Blake smiled with the same calm kindness that had quietly filled our apartment every morning back in Portland. "Because if I had shown you this before you were ready, you would have believed I was trying to save you." He paused before adding, "I never wanted to save you, Adrian. I only wanted to build a place where you could decide for yourself whether your dream was still worth believing in." Through the tall windows, I noticed neighbors gathering outside beneath the old maple trees, carrying folding tables, flower pots, baskets of flowers, and boxes filled with handmade ceramics. Children laughed while arranging colorful displays across the garden paths. Looking around the studio one final time, I realized the greatest surprise had never been the beautiful building or the pottery preserved inside it. It was discovering that someone had quietly believed in the future of my hands long enough for me to finally believe in them again. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, the peaceful farm became livelier with every passing minute. Pickup trucks and family cars rolled down the gravel lane one after another, filling the open field beside the farmhouse. Neighbors carried folding tables, flower arrangements, handmade pottery, baskets of fresh vegetables, and homemade desserts as though everyone had been preparing for a celebration that had quietly existed long before I arrived. Children ran laughing through the gardens while older couples greeted one another with warm embraces beneath strings of lights hanging from the maple trees. I stood outside the ceramic studio watching the entire scene unfold, still overwhelmed by everything I had discovered that morning. Blake noticed my expression and gently nodded toward Eleanor, who was walking toward us carrying a beautifully carved wooden box. She placed it carefully into my hands with a smile that somehow felt both proud and comforting. "These belong to you," she said softly. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters tied together with simple linen ribbon. Curious, I untied the bundle and opened the first envelope. It came from a young girl living in the neighboring town. "Dear Mr. Adrian, Mr. Blake told us you make beautiful things from ordinary clay. I hope one day you can teach me how to make something for my grandmother." I swallowed quietly before opening another letter. A retired carpenter wrote that after working with wood his entire life, he dreamed of learning pottery because he wanted to create something with his hands before growing too old to try something new. Another came from a young mother, hoping to spend more creative time with her children. Another from a high school student who admitted feeling lost and believed working with clay might help him discover confidence again. Every letter carried hope instead of expectation. Nobody asked me to become famous. Nobody cared whether my work appeared in expensive galleries. They simply believed I might help them discover the quiet joy of creating something with their own hands. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the final letter. It contained only a short note written by Blake. "I never promised anyone you would stay. I only asked them to prepare a place where you would always know you belonged if you decided to." I lowered the letter and looked around once more. Families shared meals beneath the old trees, while children proudly displayed tiny clay animals they had shaped earlier that afternoon. Elderly neighbors exchanged stories about handmade gifts they still kept from decades ago. The entire gathering felt less like a celebration and more like a reminder that creativity had always been part of everyday life here. Nobody pressured me to make a decision. Nobody asked whether I would remain. They simply welcomed me exactly as I was. For years I had believed success depended on strangers deciding whether my work deserved attention. Standing among people who valued creation more than recognition, I realized how completely I had misunderstood the purpose of art. Blake quietly joined me beneath the maple trees, watching the same peaceful evening without speaking. Together we looked toward the ceramics studio glowing warmly beneath the golden sunset. For the first time since I packed away my pottery, I no longer saw clay as something that reminded me of failure. I saw it as the beginning of countless new stories waiting patiently inside ordinary hands that only needed someone willing to believe they could still create something beautiful. That night, I could not sleep. Long after the farmhouse had gone quiet and every window had gone dark, I found myself walking alone beneath a sky overflowing with stars. The cool night air carried the familiar scent of fresh earth, blooming flowers, and damp grass, while a gentle breeze moved softly through the maple trees. I followed the winding stone path until I reached the small hill overlooking the ceramic studio. Warm lights still glowed faintly through one of its windows, making the building seem less like a workshop and more like a promise patiently waiting beneath the night sky. I sat on the old wooden fence, unfolding Blake's letter once again. This time I noticed something I had completely overlooked before. The date written in the corner was almost 3 years old, only a short time after we first became roommates. Blake had begun believing in my future before I had fully stopped believing in it myself. That realization settled quietly inside me. A few moments later, I heard familiar footsteps approaching through the grass. Blake stopped beside the fence without speaking, resting his hands in his jacket pockets while looking across the peaceful valley below. We remained silent until I finally asked the question that had been growing inside me since the morning. What would have happened if I had refused to come here? Blake smiled gently without taking his eyes off the glowing studio. Then nothing would have changed. I frowned. After everything you built? He nodded. The studio would still be here. I turned toward him, confused. Would that not have broken your heart? He shook his head slowly. No. His answer surprised me. Why not? Blake finally looked at me with the same calm expression that had quietly carried me through countless difficult days back in Portland. Because I never built this place to persuade you, he said softly. I built it so that if you ever decided to believe in yourself again, you would never have to wonder where to begin. His words carried no expectation, no pressure, and no disappointment. They simply existed as quiet truth. For years I believed every opportunity demanded something in return, and every act of kindness came with invisible conditions. Standing beside Blake beneath the stars, I realized genuine generosity asked for nothing except the freedom for another person to choose. I looked down toward the ceramic studio once more, imagining children shaping their first bowls, families laughing together around pottery wheels, neighbors discovering new confidence with clay-covered hands, and shelves slowly filling with pieces created by people who once believed they were not creative enough to try. I suddenly understood that the studio had never been built around my past. It had always been built around other people's future. I folded Blake's letter carefully and slipped it back into my pocket before taking a slow breath. I spent years believing I stopped working with clay because customers stopped buying my pottery, I admitted quietly. The truth is I stopped because I decided my own hands were no longer worth trusting. Blake listened without interrupting. I smiled gently, feeling lighter than I had in years. I am not staying because I owe anyone an answer, I said. I am staying because this is the first place where I have remembered that creating something beautiful was never about proving my value. It was always about sharing a small piece of hope with someone else, and I finally want to create again. 1 year later, the quiet farm had become a place that people traveled hours to visit, not because it appeared in magazines or tourist guides, but because word had quietly spread that something special happened there. Every Saturday morning, the ceramic studio came alive before sunrise as children, parents, retirees, and curious beginners gathered around pottery wheels with clay-covered hands and hopeful smiles. Laughter echoed through the open workshop while sunlight poured across rows of handcrafted tables where ordinary pieces of clay slowly became bowls, mugs, sculptures, and memories that families carried home together. The shelves that had once displayed only my forgotten work now held hundreds of creations shaped by people who had discovered that perfection had never been the goal. Confidence was. I no longer measured my life by sales, exhibition invitations, or whether someone believed my pottery deserved recognition. Instead, I measured it by the smile of a young child proudly carrying home a first handmade cup, by an elderly neighbor quietly thanking me for helping him rediscover a hobby he thought age had taken away, and by the peaceful silence that filled the studio whenever people completely lost themselves in the simple joy of creating. Somewhere along the way, I stopped worrying about whether my dream had returned because I realized it had never actually disappeared. It had simply been waiting for me to become brave enough to welcome it home again. One autumn afternoon, I finished a large ceramic vase inspired by the rolling fields surrounding the farm. Rather than selling it, I placed it near the entrance of the studio where every visitor would see it before beginning their own work. Beneath the vase rested a small wooden plaque carved by Blake's grandfather. It contained only 3 simple words: create with hope. Visitors often pause to read those words before asking why they mattered so much. I always smiled before answering that clay remembers every hand that shapes it, just as people remember every act of kindness that helps them believe in themselves again. Blake never asked for recognition. Every morning he quietly unlocked the studio before sunrise, tended the flower gardens surrounding the workshop, repaired shelves whenever they needed attention, and somehow always prepared fresh coffee before the first students arrived. Sometimes I caught him standing near the doorway watching children proudly carry home their first handmade pottery. He never interrupted their excitement. He simply smiled with the same quiet warmth that had first convinced me to trust him. One peaceful evening, after the final pottery class of the season ended, we climbed the familiar hill overlooking the farm together. The ceramics studio glowed warmly below us while families loaded carefully wrapped pottery into their cars beneath the golden colors of sunset. I looked across the valley, remembering the discouraged artist who had arrived believing his future had quietly ended years before. Then I turned toward Blake with gratitude that words could never fully express. "You told me there was something waiting for me here," I said softly. He smiled. "Did you find it?" I looked toward the studio, the gardens, the community that had quietly become family, and the countless hands still shaping hope from ordinary clay. Then I answered with complete certainty. I thought I came here to rebuild my dream. Instead, I discovered that the most beautiful things are never the ones we create alone. They are the ones shaped by people who quietly believe in us until we finally remember how to believe in ourselves again.